What happens when trust is shattered? When the person you love betrays you in the worst possible way? Follow Nate's journey as he uncovers the truth behind his wife's affair, leading to a heartbreaking decision that will change everything. Can forgiveness heal the wounds, or is it too late? Watch until the end to see how one man's world crumbles. And what comes next? Where are you when you're watching this story unfold? Nate Jackson stood by the kitchen window, watching the morning sun filter through the trees. Another day, another round of meetings, emails, and deadlines. His job as a construction project manager consumed most of his time, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd had a full day off. At 43, he had everything he'd ever wanted. His career was thriving, his home was perfect, and his family seemingly was too. Sophie, his wife of 18 years, sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone with a distracted expression. Her platinum blonde hair fell loosely around her shoulders, but the spark that used to light up her eyes was no longer there. He noticed it often lately, this emptiness in her gaze, but he shrugged it off. Life had gotten busy. They were both juggling their careers, managing Lily's teenage years and keeping everything together. Surely that was enough to explain the distance growing between them. "Morning," Nate said, offering a smile as he grabbed his coffee cup. Sophie glanced up and gave him a half-hearted smile. "Morning." The silence between them hung in the air, thick with unspoken words. Nate wanted to ask how her day was going, if there was anything on her mind, but it felt pointless. Conversations had become short, clipped, more like polite exchanges than the deep, affectionate talks they used to have. Sophie's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, her face momentarily changing, a flicker of something Nate couldn't identify flashing across her expression. But before he could catch it, she quickly picked up the phone and read the message, her fingers tapping rapidly on the screen. "Who was that?" Nate asked, his voice casual but the tension in his chest tightening with every second that passed. "Just work stuff," Sophie replied, setting the phone down. She forced a smile again, but Nate could see the strain in her eyes. She wasn't being honest, and something inside him began to stir, an unsettling feeling he couldn't explain. He had known Sophie long enough to know when she was hiding something. But what? Was it just stress? Was it the long hours, the constant pressure of their careers? Or was it something more? His mind couldn't help but race, even as he pushed the thoughts down, telling himself he was overthinking. "All right, I'm heading out. Big meeting today," Nate said, standing up. "We'll talk later?" Sophie didn't answer immediately. She simply nodded, and then, just as Nate was about to leave the kitchen, she spoke softly. "Yeah, later." There it was again, the distance, the lack of warmth in her voice. Nate's heart sank as he grabbed his briefcase and left for the office. The day unfolded as usual, filled with phone calls, site visits, and endless paperwork. But in the back of his mind, a question lingered. Had things really changed? Was Sophie really just stressed? Or was there something else? He hadn't noticed anything major. There were no blatant signs, no screaming arguments, no obvious red flags. But something was off. As the day wore on, Nate couldn't shake the feeling that the perfect image of his life was beginning to crack. He didn't want to admit it, but deep down he knew he needed to pay more attention to his marriage, to Sophie, to the little things he'd stopped noticing, like the way she checked her phone at every available moment, the way she avoided eye contact during their conversations, the way she never seemed to really look at him anymore. By the time he got home that evening, he was exhausted, but his mind wouldn't rest. Sophie was already there, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone again. The moment he walked through the door, she didn't even look up. "Hey, how was your day?" Nate asked, trying to sound casual. "It was fine," Sophie replied, her voice flat. She didn't even look up from her screen. Nate stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling the weight of the silence between them. He had spent the day surrounded by people, by work, by deadlines. But the loneliness he felt now, standing in his own home, was overwhelming. He felt the sudden urge to ask her, to demand answers, but he didn't. Not yet. He wasn't sure he was ready. Instead, he simply nodded and headed toward the bedroom, his mind racing with questions he didn't want to ask. Sophie remained on the couch, her eyes glued to her phone, her silence louder than any words could have been. Nate sat at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on the mug in front of him. The coffee was cold, but he hadn't taken a sip. His thoughts kept drifting back to Sophie, her coldness, her distance. It had been days since that awkward conversation in the morning, and things had only gotten worse. He kept telling himself it was just stress, just the pressures of life. But deep down, something told him it was more. The front door opened, and Nate's attention snapped to the sound. Lily, his 16-year-old daughter, stepped into the room, her school bag slung over one shoulder. She gave him a tired smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Something was off with her, too. "Hey, kiddo," Nate said, trying to sound casual, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Hi, Dad," Lily muttered, her voice low. She kicked off her shoes and dropped her bag by the door before heading into the kitchen. Nate watched her for a moment. There was something about her posture, something in her face that made him uneasy. Lily had always been a sensitive kid, sharp but quiet when it came to her emotions. But lately she'd been withdrawn, and not just because of the usual teenage stuff. He took a deep breath. "Everything okay, Lil?" Lily didn't immediately answer. She stood by the counter, rummaging through the fridge, her back to him. Nate could see her shoulders tense, and he knew something was coming. It was always in the silence, the hesitation before the storm. Finally, she turned around, her eyes downcast. "Dad, I need to tell you something." Nate's heart skipped a beat. He set his coffee mug down and leaned forward, trying to gauge the seriousness in her voice. "What is it, honey?" Lily bit her lip, eyes darting around the kitchen like she was trying to find the right words. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by an unsettling sense of guilt. She swallowed hard. "I overheard something I don't think I was supposed to hear." Nate felt the blood drain from his face. His breath caught in his throat. A million thoughts rushed through his mind, but he couldn't find the words. "What do you mean?" he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. Lily took a step closer, her hands clasped in front of her like she was holding on to something for support. "I overheard Mom. Last week, she was talking to someone." She paused as though gathering courage. "She was talking to a man. Someone named Alex." Nate's heart clenched. The room seemed to grow smaller. The name Alex buzzed in his ears, but the words didn't make sense. Sophie had been distant, yes, but to hear this, his daughter, his sweet daughter, speaking those words, it was too much. "Lily, Nate stopped himself, not knowing how to ask the question. But Lily's face, so full of pain, gave him the answer before he could finish. She wasn't just talking to him. It wasn't like a normal conversation, Dad. She sounded like she was hiding something, like it wasn't just a work thing. Nate's head swam. The thoughts that had been swirling in his mind all week suddenly crashed together into a brutal reality. He wanted to scream, to demand answers right there, but he couldn't. Not with Lily standing in front of him, her face so full of worry, so full of guilt for even having to carry this secret. He reached for her, pulling her into a hug. "I know this is hard, sweetie, but you did the right thing by telling me. Thank you." His voice was hoarse, filled with an emotion he hadn't expected to feel, grief. Lily clung to him, her face buried in his chest. "I didn't want to hurt you, Dad, but I didn't know what else to do. I don't know what's going on with her. I think she's hiding something from you." Nate didn't know what to say. His mind was racing, trying to process what he'd just heard. The words affair, betrayal, secrets all clung to him like a shadow. He couldn't wrap his head around it. Sophie, his Sophie, had been hiding something from him. She had been lying to him, and his daughter knew before he did. "Hey," he said, pulling back from the hug to look at her. "This isn't your fault, okay? We'll figure this out, together." Lily nodded, but her eyes were still clouded with doubt, with worry. She wasn't sure if she was doing the right thing. She wasn't sure if telling him was enough. Nate could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him, and the pain of realizing that his daughter, his little girl, had been carrying this burden on her own. But as the anger and confusion welled up inside him, he knew one thing. He couldn't let this go. He needed to know the truth. "I'm going to talk to your mom tonight," Nate said, his voice firm, "and we'll get through this, no matter what happens." Lily nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. But she knew, just as he did, that everything was about to change. The morning after Lily's confession, Nate couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. His mind kept replaying the words she had said, the way she described Sophie's conversations with Alex. The unease in his chest had only grown since, gnawing at him with every passing moment. He couldn't understand how he hadn't seen it before. The subtle signs, the distance, the way Sophie avoided his gaze when they were together. How had he been so blind? Nate had always been a man of routine, steady and reliable. He prided himself on being the rock of his family. But now, with every step, every glance at Sophie, his certainty felt like a distant memory. What if Lily was right? What if everything he thought he knew about his marriage was a lie? He spent the morning at work, trying to push away the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him. But when the clock struck noon, he found himself standing outside the door to their bedroom, staring at the familiar brass handle. Something inside him told him to go in, to look for what he knew deep down he had to find. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the quiet of their home seemed to amplify the stillness of the room. Sophie wasn't there, thankfully, but Nate couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was somewhere, hidden in plain sight. He walked over to the dresser, his eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Just a feeling, a clue, something that would explain the heaviness he felt in his chest. His fingers brushed over Sophie's things, her perfume bottles, her jewelry, the small trinkets that made the room feel like hers. He tried to push aside the guilt that was growing in his stomach, snooping, invading her privacy. But the nagging voice inside him wouldn't let him stop. That's when he saw it. A small black phone lying on the edge of Sophie's nightstand. He didn't recognize it. It wasn't hers, at least not one he'd seen her use before. His heart skipped a beat, and his hand trembled as he picked it up. It was almost weightless in his palm. Nate hesitated for a moment, staring at the phone as though it might bite. But he knew. He had to look. He had to know. With a deep breath, he powered it on. The screen lit up, and Nate quickly unlocked it. Sophie had never been the type to use a password, so he easily accessed the phone. His hands shook as he scrolled through the messages. There, hidden among the innocuous notifications, were texts between Sophie and Alex. The first one read, "Can't wait to see you tonight. You make me feel alive." Nate's stomach twisted. He read through a few more messages, each one confirming what he'd feared. Sophie wasn't just talking to Alex. They were texting each other like they were lovers, hidden behind the veil of secrecy. The last message sent by Alex was the worst. "I can't do this much longer. I want you all to myself. When will you leave him?" Nate felt his knees go weak. The words were like a punch to the gut. Sophie had been planning this, hiding this. There was no longer any doubt in his mind. He dropped the phone onto the bed as if it were on fire, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced, struggling to catch up with the crushing weight of the evidence in front of him. He stood there for a long time, the room spinning as his world cracked open. Sophie's betrayal was no longer a feeling or a suspicion. It was a reality, laid out before him in cold, hard texts. The love he thought was there, the trust he had placed in her. It all felt like a lie. The door to the bedroom creaked open and Sophie walked in, looking surprised to see him standing there, frozen. Her eyes flickered from the phone to his face, but Nate didn't look at her. He couldn't. He didn't want to see the excuses, the lies that he knew were coming. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat when she saw the fury in his eyes. Sophie took a hesitant step forward. "Nate, Why, Sophie?" Nate's voice was barely a whisper, but it felt like thunder in the stillness of the room. He looked at her now, his gaze cold. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Sophie's face twisted in confusion, then shame, and finally something else. Something Nate didn't expect. Fear. She could see that he knew. She knew the game was up. Her voice trembled as she tried to explain, Nate, it's not what you think." But Nate cut her off, his words sharp and final. Don't lie to me anymore." The weight of the phone on the bed, The messages, the reality of her betrayal, it was all too much. The room felt suffocating, and Nate couldn't stay there any longer. He turned and walked out, leaving Sophie standing in the middle of the room, her eyes wide with panic, her heart pounding with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of the past few days was almost unbearable. Nate couldn't shake the images in his mind, the texts, the words, the lies. Sophie's betrayal had pierced through him like nothing he had ever felt before, leaving him stunned and angry. He needed answers, and not just from the cold, hollow words she had given him earlier. After he stormed out of the bedroom, he knew he couldn't face her again, not yet. But one thought kept gnawing at him. He had to know the full extent of the affair. He had to see it with his own eyes. No more second-guessing, no more wondering if it was all in his head. Sophie had been hiding something, and now Nate was determined to uncover every last bit of it. That evening, as Sophie left the house after dinner, Nate's heart raced. She had dressed up, different from her usual relaxed home clothes, her hair styled with more care. She looked different. She looked like the woman who had been pretending to be someone else. Nate felt his stomach twist as he grabbed his coat and quietly followed her. He kept a safe distance, careful not to be seen. His steps felt heavy, each one filled with dread but also determination. What was she doing? Where was she going? It wasn't just about her betrayal anymore, it was about the truth that somehow he had been blind to for so long. Sophie moved quickly, heading down the street and toward the parking lot of a nearby cafe. Nate's pulse quickened. The weight of the situation hit him all over again, and his mind raced as he watched her through the dim streetlights. He couldn't follow too closely. He couldn't let her know he was watching, but that didn't stop his heart from pounding in his chest. He continued behind her, trying to keep his movements subtle. As Sophie reached her car, she glanced around, as though making sure no one saw her. Nate ducked behind a car, holding his breath. He wanted to move closer, but his legs felt like lead. For a moment, he thought she might turn around, see him, and everything would come crashing down. But Sophie got into her car without a second thought, and drove off, the headlights illuminating the empty street before disappearing around the corner. Nate stood frozen for a beat, his mind reeling. Should he follow her? Should he wait and see where she went next? He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find. The answers felt like they were slipping through his fingers, but he couldn't stop. He had to know. With a deep breath, he started following her. The drive felt like it lasted forever, each minute stretching out in painful anticipation. His eyes fixed on the taillights of Sophie's car as they passed through the winding streets of their town. She didn't seem to be in a hurry, and that only made Nate's nerves worse. Was she meeting Alex? Was this the night? Would he finally get the confirmation he had been dreading, or was he jumping to conclusions again? As they drove farther out of town, Nate's thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Sophie's car pulling into a parking lot near a small hotel. His heart skipped a beat. He had seen that hotel before, but never with Sophie, not once. And now, here she was, pulling into the lot without hesitation. He parked a few rows down, heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but seeing Sophie walk into that hotel with no fear, no second thoughts, told him everything he needed to know. His fingers clenched around the steering wheel, and his breathing became shallow. He couldn't move. Sophie didn't look back. She simply walked inside, disappearing through the hotel's entrance. Nate remained in his car for several minutes, wrestling with himself. Every part of him wanted to storm in there and confront her, to tear down the facade. But he stayed put, unable to bring himself to face her yet. He wasn't ready. The rawness of everything was too much to bear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Nate started his car and left. He didn't know what would happen next. All he knew was that his world had changed forever, and there was no going back. The moment Nate stepped into the house, a cold chill swept over him. Everything felt different, as if the walls themselves could feel the weight of the truth that had been exposed. The house that had once felt like home now seemed like a foreign place. His footsteps echoed down the hall, but there was no warmth in the familiar sound. Sophie was in the living room, sitting on the couch. She didn't look up when he walked in, her gaze fixed on the floor. Her phone was in her hands, but she wasn't reading it. Her fingers moved absent-mindedly across the screen as if she were waiting, as if she knew this moment was coming but didn't know how to face it. Nate stopped in the doorway, his body tense, his jaw clenched. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, the words he'd rehearsed in his mind failing to come out. The silence between them stretched on, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Finally, Sophie looked up, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mix of guilt and fear. For a moment, neither of them said anything. It felt like time had frozen, like they were suspended in the air, unsure of what would happen next. Nate couldn't hold it in any longer. His voice, when it finally came, was low but full of raw emotion. "Sophie," he began, his voice breaking as the words he never thought he'd have to say slipped out. "I know." Sophie's breath caught in her throat and she stood up quickly, her face flushing with panic. "Nate, Don't," Nate interrupted, his eyes burning with hurt and betrayal. "Don't try to explain. I know everything." His voice was shaky now, the anger rising in him, but it was mixed with something else, pain. He was suffocating under the weight of it. "I saw the messages. I saw your phone. I saw the lies." Sophie's hands trembled as she tried to steady herself, but the guilt was written all over her face. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words got stuck. The silence between them deepened, but this time it was no longer the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of truth, the truth that neither of them could escape. "You've been lying to me, Sophie," Nate continued, his voice hardening with every word. "To both of us. For months, He paused, his chest tightening. "You were seeing him. You were seeing Alex behind my back." Sophie took a step back, as if the words were physical blows. She opened her mouth again, but Nate could see the tears welling up in her eyes. He didn't want to see her cry. Not now, not after everything she had done. "Please, Nate, I never wanted it to happen like this. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to go so far, but you—" Sophie stopped, struggling to find the right words. "I was lonely. I felt like I wasn't important to you anymore. You were always working and I needed someone to talk to, someone who made me feel seen." Nate's fists clenched. Her words cut through him deeper than anything else. He wanted to yell, to scream at her, to make her feel the same pain he was drowning in. But what could he say? She had already betrayed him in the worst way possible. "You think I didn't notice?" Nate's voice was barely a whisper now. "You think I didn't see you pulling away, Sophie? You think I didn't feel the distance growing between us?" His breath came out in a shaky sigh as he took a step forward. "I wasn't perfect, but I was trying, Sophie. I was trying so hard, and you—" His voice broke as his emotions finally spilled over. "You threw everything away. For him." Sophie shook her head, tears streaming down her face now. "Nate, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I didn't think it would get this far, but it did, and "Stop," Nate snapped, his chest tightening as he fought to hold it all together. "I don't want your apologies, Sophie. I don't want to hear how sorry you are, because sorry doesn't fix this." He let out a shaky breath, stepping back as the weight of everything hit him again. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this." The silence that followed was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken words and painful truths. Sophie looked at him, her face crumpling in regret, but Nate couldn't find it in himself to comfort her. Not now, not after everything. I don't know what to do," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. "I've ruined everything. I ruined us." Nate couldn't look at her anymore. His heart was broken, shattered by the woman he had trusted, the woman he thought he knew. He turned away, his feet heavy as he walked toward the door. "Sophie," he said without turning back, his voice cold. "I don't know what happens next, but I need time. I need to think." As he left, he didn't look back. The house that had once felt like home now felt like a prison, and for the first time, Nate wasn't sure if he could find his way back. Nate sat in the dimly lit living room, his hands gripping the edge of the couch as if it could anchor him to something solid. Sophie's words echoed in his mind, but they were already beginning to feel distant, overshadowed by the crushing weight of what he'd just uncovered. The phone, the messages, it was all real. Sophie's betrayal was no longer just a suspicion, it was a reality that had shattered the foundation of his entire life. He stared at the small piece of paper in front of him, the phone number he had gotten from the private investigator, Alex's number, the man Sophie had been seeing for months. Nate didn't know why, but he couldn't stop staring at it. It felt like holding the key to the truth. The last piece of the puzzle. But there was more, wasn't there? He had this nagging feeling that there were things Sophie hadn't told him, things she had hidden, things that went deeper than just an affair. The silence in the house was unbearable. Everything felt like a blur. The confrontation, the tears, the broken trust. He stood up, pacing the room, trying to think clearly. Sophie had admitted to the affair, but there was something about the way she spoke, the way she avoided looking him in the eyes, that made him feel like she was still holding something back. He grabbed his phone and dialed the number. His heart raced as the phone rang. Each second felt like an eternity. Finally, the line clicked and a voice answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was smooth, almost too calm. "Alex," Nate said, his voice low but steady. "We need to talk." There was a brief pause, then the voice responded, a hint of amusement in it. "Who is this?" "It doesn't matter," Nate replied, his patience thinning. "What matters is what you've done to my family." The line was silent for a moment, then Alex chuckled lightly, a sound that made Nate's blood boil. "Look, I don't know what Sophie has told you, but it's none of your business," Alex said, his tone dismissive. Nate's pulse quickened, the anger rising in his chest. "It is my business when you're sleeping with my wife. You've destroyed my family, and now I want answers." Alex sighed, clearly unfazed by Nate's anger. "I'm not going to explain myself to you. Sophie and I have been seeing each other for months. You've been so wrapped up in your work you didn't even notice. If anything, that's on you." The words hit Nate like a punch in the gut. He had always worked hard to provide for his family, but hearing Alex's words made him feel like a failure. He felt the weight of everything he had neglected, the small moments, the signs, the distance between him and Sophie that had been there all along. "You're a coward," Nate spat. "You used her, and you knew she was married." Alex's voice grew colder. "I didn't make her choices. She came to me, not the other way around. But if you're looking for someone to blame, blame yourself. You didn't give her what she needed." Nate gritted his teeth, the anger bubbling over. "I trusted you, both of you, but now I'm done." He hung up before Alex could say anything else, his chest heaving with the force of his emotions. The truth had been laid bare. Sophie's affair was more than just a betrayal. It was a weapon that had been used to tear apart everything he thought he knew. But there was still something about the conversation that didn't sit right with him. Something felt off. Why had Sophie been so defensive when he confronted her? Why had Alex acted so indifferent? Nate's mind raced. He needed to know more. He needed to dig deeper, even if it meant facing the truth he wasn't ready for. The next morning, Nate found himself back in the bedroom, the place where it all began. He wasn't sure why he was back here, but something told him the answers were hidden somewhere in this room. He started going through the drawers, pushing aside clothes, rifling through items he hadn't touched in years. And that's when he found it. A small envelope, tucked away in the back of Sophie's drawer, sealed shut. His heart skipped a beat as he carefully opened it, pulling out a stack of photos. The first one was of Sophie and Alex, standing together, laughing in what appeared to be a hotel room. Another showed them holding hands, walking down a street at night. The photos were candid, personal, intimate in a way that made Nate's stomach churn. There were more photos, all taken in different places, different settings. They weren't just lovers. They were building a life together. Sophie hadn't just been seeking comfort in Alex. She had been fully invested in this relationship, in a way Nate hadn't even realized. Nate's hands shook as he dropped the photos onto the bed. He had been betrayed in ways he hadn't even imagined. The affair wasn't just about sex or a passing fling. It was about a deep emotional connection. And Sophie had been lying to him, to their family, every step of the way. He stared at the photos, the silence of the house now suffocating him. The weight of the secrets, of the lies, was too much. He didn't know how to move forward, but one thing was certain. Sophie wasn't the woman he thought she was. The silence in the house had become unbearable. Every room, every corner felt heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Nate had spent the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind running through the same painful loop. The photos, the phone, the lies, the betrayal. Each piece of evidence had chipped away at his trust, but now, standing in front of Sophie again, it felt like the final blow. Sophie had tried to apologize over and over again, but each word she spoke only seemed to make things worse. She stood across the room, wringing her hands, her eyes red from crying, but Nate could no longer find the sympathy he once had for her. All he felt now was a cold, suffocating rage. "I don't know what you want from me, Nate," Sophie said, her voice shaking, but Nate could hear the desperation in her tone. She stepped forward, her hands reaching out, but he took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "I want the truth," Nate said, his voice barely above a whisper, but the force of it felt like a roar inside his head. "All of it." Sophie flinched, her eyes darting away from his, unable to hold his gaze. "Nate, please. I've told you everything. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you." "Stop!" Nate snapped, his emotions finally breaking free. His voice cracked as the anger bubbled to the surface. "Stop lying to me, Sophie. I've seen the pictures. I've read the texts. I know everything. You didn't just make a mistake. You chose this. You chose him over me, over us." Her face went pale, the color draining from her as though the words had physically struck her. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. For the first time, Sophie was speechless. "Why?" Nate's voice was raw now, filled with hurt and disbelief. "Why him? Why Alex? What did I do to deserve this?" Sophie's tears fell freely now, her face contorted in regret. I don't know. It wasn't about him, Nate. It was about me. I felt so empty for so long. You were always gone, working. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore." Nate's chest tightened. He had always tried to be there for her, tried to balance his work and home life. But now, hearing her words, it felt like nothing he did had ever been enough. "And you think that's an excuse?" He shot back, his voice breaking. "You think having an affair is the answer? You think lying to me, betraying me, is what fixes everything?" Sophie's sobs were quiet, but Nate could feel the weight of her shame. She was broken, but so was he. There was no going back from this, no repairing the shattered trust between them. "I never wanted this, Nate. I never wanted to hurt you, but She choked on her words, unable to finish the sentence. "I don't know how we can come back from this." The silence between them was deafening. Nate stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think. Everything he had believed in, everything he had fought for, was slipping through his fingers. "You don't get to decide that, Sophie," Nate said quietly, his heart heavy with the weight of finality. "You've already decided for both of us." Sophie's eyes searched his face as though trying to find a glimmer of the man she once knew. But there was nothing there. Nate was no longer the man who could forgive her, the man who could look past her mistakes. The man she had married was gone, replaced by someone who had been betrayed in ways that couldn't be undone. He turned away from her, his throat tight with emotion. "I don't know who you are anymore," Nate muttered, the words hanging in the air between them like an insurmountable wall. "I don't know how we can go on, how we can even look at each other after this." Sophie collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her hands, the sobs racking her body. Nate didn't move. He couldn't. He couldn't be the man who had once comforted her, who had wiped away her tears. That man was gone. "I need space," Nate said, his voice hoarse. He didn't look back as he walked toward the door, each step feeling like a mile. He couldn't breathe in the same air as her anymore. He couldn't bear the thought of being in that house with her, of pretending like everything was okay. Sophie's cries grew louder as he reached the door, but Nate couldn't bring himself to stop. He couldn't bring himself to give her the comfort she was asking for. Not now. He left the house, his mind clouded with 1,000 emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal. But most of all, there was a gnawing emptiness, a hollow ache deep in his chest, that nothing seemed to fill. The tension in the house had only escalated since the confrontation. The once familiar home now felt like a battleground, the walls closing in on Nate with every passing hour. Every glance between him and Sophie was heavy with unspoken words, every moment weighed down by the invisible divide that had grown between them. Nate spent his days at work, trying to distract himself from the suffocating reality of his home life. The anger was still there, burning beneath the surface, but now it was accompanied by a deep sadness. He couldn't stop thinking about the betrayal, about the lies, about Sophie, the woman he had trusted with everything, now reduced to a stranger. He wasn't the only one suffering. Lily had withdrawn even further, her rebellious behavior growing more intense by the day. She had stopped speaking to Sophie altogether, barely acknowledging her presence. It was as if she couldn't look at her mother without seeing the woman who had destroyed their family. Nate walked through the door after another long day, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet. He could hear the faint sound of Lily's music from upstairs, but the silence between him and Sophie was deafening. Sophie sat on the couch, her eyes swollen from crying. She had been trying unsuccessfully to reach out to Lily, but it was as if every word she spoke pushed her daughter further away. Nate stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to say something, to break the silence, but he couldn't find the words. The space between him and Sophie felt vast, like an ocean that neither of them could cross. Sophie looked up, her eyes meeting his. For a brief moment, Nate saw the woman he had loved, the woman who had stood by his side through thick and thin. But that woman was gone now, replaced by someone he didn't recognize, someone who had chosen to betray everything they had built together. "Lily's not talking to me," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what to do, Nate. She won't even look at me." Nate's jaw tightened, the familiar guilt creeping in. But it wasn't his fault. Sophie had made her choices. She had shattered their family, and now it was too late to fix it. "You can't expect her to just forgive you, Sophie," Nate said, his voice flat. He tried to keep his anger in check, but it was hard. So hard. "She's hurt. We're both hurt. And right now, all I can think about is how you've ruined everything." Sophie's face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands, unable to hide the tears that had become all too familiar. "I'm so sorry," she choked out. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean to hurt Lily, but I was lost, Nate. I felt invisible. You were never here, and I made the worst mistake of my life." Nate couldn't bring himself to respond. He had heard those words 100 times now. "I'm sorry" wasn't enough. It would never be enough. He took a deep breath and turned toward the stairs. "I'm going to talk to Lily," he said, his voice soft but firm. He needed to do something. He couldn't fix Sophie, but he could at least try to help his daughter. Sophie didn't say anything as he left the room. She didn't have to. The silence between them spoke volumes. Upstairs, Nate found Lily sitting on the edge of her bed, headphones in, music blasting. She didn't notice him standing in the doorway at first, lost in her world. He could see the exhaustion in her face, the way her shoulders slumped. It hurt him to see her like this, so lost, so angry. "Lily," Nate said softly, his voice gentle but full of the weight of everything they had been through. She took out her headphones but didn't look up. "Dad, I don't want to talk," she muttered, her voice distant. "I don't want to hear anything about Mom. She's ruined everything." Nate's heart broke at the words. "I know, sweetie, I know. But I need you to understand that I'm here for you. No matter what happens with your mom and me, I'm not going anywhere." Lily's eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, shaking her head. "You don't get it, Dad. You don't understand what it feels like. I thought Mom was the one who always had my back. And now she's gone." "She's still your mom, Lily," Nate said, sitting down beside her. "But I get it. I get that you're hurt. We're both hurt. But we can't keep holding on to this anger. It's not going to fix anything." Lily turned to face him, her eyes filled with pain. "I don't want to forgive her, Dad. I don't want to pretend like everything's okay. It's not." Nate took a deep breath, his own emotions threatening to spill over. "I know it's not okay, and I'm not asking you to forgive her right now, but we have to find a way to move forward, together." Lily didn't respond right away. She just sat there staring at the floor, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. It wasn't forgiveness that Nate needed. It was a chance, just a chance to heal, to rebuild what was left of their family. Downstairs, Sophie's sobs had softened into quiet weeping. The house was filled with the sound of brokenness. But in that moment, Nate realized that maybe they could still salvage something, even if it wasn't what it once was. The decision to confront Alex had been weighing heavily on Nate's mind. It was the one thing he had been putting off, telling himself that speaking to the man who had so easily stepped into his life and betrayed him would only make things worse. But it didn't matter anymore. The rage inside him had grown too intense, the desire to understand why Alex had done this too urgent. Nate had spent days replaying the conversation in his head. What was he supposed to say? What did he even want from Alex? Revenge? A confession? Answers? Maybe all of it. He just needed to see the man behind the affair, the one who had taken everything from him, and confront him face to face. He found Alex's address, buried deep in the details Sophie had hidden. He wasn't sure what he expected, but as he drove to the address, a feeling of cold determination settled over him. The images of Sophie and Alex together, the countless messages, the betrayal, all of it had built to this moment. He couldn't let it go any longer. He had to confront the man who had stolen his wife. Nate parked his car a few houses down from the address and sat for a moment, staring at the apartment complex. His heart raced as he stared at the building, but his mind was made up. It was time. He walked to the front door and rang the buzzer. His finger hovered over the button for a moment as he steadied his breath. The anticipation was suffocating. He could hear footsteps approaching on the other side. The door clicked open. Alex stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing when he saw Nate standing there. There was no sign of fear or surprise, just a look of cold indifference. Alex had always been confident, always in control, but Nate could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the realization that he had been found out. "What do you want?" Alex asked, his voice calm but with a hint of annoyance. "I want answers," Nate replied, his voice low but firm. "I want to know why. Why her? Why my family?" Alex shrugged, not the least bit intimidated. "I don't owe you an explanation, man. Sophie and we had something. It just happened." Nate's blood boiled. "You think that's an excuse? You think just because she came to you that gives you the right to tear apart my family?" Alex smirked, stepping back from the door as if daring Nate to come inside. "You want to know the truth? Fine. But don't act like you're some saint. Your wife was a grown woman. She knew what she was doing. Maybe if you had been around, paid attention, she wouldn't have needed someone else." The words stung more than Nate had expected. He wanted to yell, to lash out, but he held back, his fists clenched at his sides. This wasn't about fighting. This was about understanding the depths of the betrayal, the man behind it, and the motive that had driven him to destroy everything Nate had worked for. "You're disgusting," Nate said, his voice thick with contempt. "You used her. You used her to get what you wanted, and now my whole life is falling apart because of it." Alex's smirk faded, replaced with a more guarded expression. "Look, I don't owe you anything. Sophie came to me. She was unhappy. She was looking for something. And yeah, I gave it to her. But don't act like you didn't see it coming. You weren't there for her. You were too busy with your job, your career, your damn project. She needed someone who cared." Nate's chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. The words hit hard, harder than he was ready for. He had always worked hard for his family. He had always tried to be the provider, the protector. But Alex's words made him question everything. Had he been neglecting Sophie? Had he pushed her away so much that she had no choice but to find someone else? "You don't get to blame me for your actions," Nate growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm not the one who lied, who betrayed my family." Alex raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "I'm not blaming you, I'm just telling you how it is. You were absent, man, and Sophie? She was looking for something real, something more than you could give her." Nate stood there for a moment, processing Alex's words, the weight of his indifference. The man had no remorse, no regret. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He had no idea the damage he had caused. And Nate knew in that moment that no apology would ever be enough. Alex had taken something irreplaceable from him, and the damage was done. Nate's anger reached its peak. "Get out of my face, Alex," he said, his voice cold and final. "You're not worth my time." Alex didn't argue. He simply gave Nate one last look, then slammed the door shut in his face. Nate stood there for a moment, his heart pounding, his fists still clenched. The confrontation had been everything he expected, cold, dismissive, and filled with disdain. But it didn't bring the closure he thought it would. It only left him feeling more empty than before. As Nate turned to walk away, he realized something. The confrontation hadn't been for Alex. It had been for him. He needed to face this, to see it with his own eyes. But now it was clear that nothing would ever bring back what he had lost. The weight of the decision had been building inside Nate for days, maybe even weeks. He hadn't wanted it to come to this. Divorce had always seemed like a distant concept, something that happened to other people, not to him, not to them. But now, as he stood in front of the cold, blank legal forms in the living room, it felt inevitable. Sophie had begged. She'd cried, apologized, told him how sorry she was. She claimed she was lost, that she had made a mistake, that she would do anything to fix it. But the more she begged, the less Nate could hear her. Her words no longer carried the weight they once did. She had shattered the trust that had been the foundation of their relationship, and there was no going back. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about everything that had led up to it. The growing distance between them, the silent nights, the conversations that had grown more strained, more forced, until they couldn't even pretend to care for each other anymore. And the more Nate thought about it, the more he realized something. He had been living in a lie for too long. Lily's anger had only made things harder. She blamed Sophie entirely, refusing to talk to her mother, shutting her out. It hurt Nate to see Lily this way, but it also reinforced the truth of it all. The family they had been wasn't coming back, not after everything that had happened. He hadn't told Sophie about the papers yet. Part of him wanted to avoid the confrontation, wanted to put it off, but he knew he couldn't. The emotional toll of the past few weeks had drained him. Every argument, every tear-filled apology from Sophie had only made the rift between them wider, deeper. There was no love left, no trust. Nate picked up the pen, his fingers trembling slightly as he hovered over the papers. His mind raced. Was he doing the right thing? Was this the only option left? He didn't know anymore. All he knew was that he couldn't continue living like this. He couldn't continue pretending that things would magically get better, that somehow they would fix it. The decision felt like a weight lifting off his chest, but also like an anchor dragging him under. It was one thing to make the choice, but the reality of it was another. What would life look like after this? Would he and Sophie ever be able to coexist? Could they even be in the same room again without the air crackling with unspoken words? Nate closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and signed the papers. The finality of the action was chilling. There was no turning back now. When Sophie came home later that evening, she knew something was wrong. The silence between them was heavy, charged with the words neither of them wanted to speak. She walked into the living room and stopped in her tracks when she saw the papers on the table. "Sophie," Nate began, his voice calm but firm, "I've made my decision. I'm filing for divorce." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sophie stood frozen, her eyes wide, disbelief written all over her face. "Nate, no, please, we can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Sophie, we've been down this road already. I don't want to keep doing this. I don't want to keep pretending. I don't trust you anymore, and I can't live like this. I'm done." Her face crumpled in pain, and the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. She stepped forward, but Nate didn't move. He couldn't. He had made his decision, and as much as it hurt, he knew it was the right one. For both of them. "I'm sorry," Sophie whispered, her voice broken. "I never meant for this to happen. I love you, Nate. I made a terrible mistake. Please don't do this." Nate's heart twisted at the sound of her voice, but the anger that had built up over the weeks made it easier to stay resolute. It's too late for apologies, Sophie. I don't even know who you are anymore." Sophie collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking with sobs. She reached out as if hoping he would change his mind, but Nate didn't reach back. He couldn't. He had given everything to this relationship, and now it was gone. "I'll be moving out tomorrow," Nate said, his voice steady. "We need some space. We both do." Sophie's sobs filled the room, the sound of her pain almost unbearable, but Nate knew there was no other choice. He had already made the hardest decision of his life. Now all that was left was to move forward, no matter how difficult that might be. As Nate walked to the door, he paused and turned to look at Sophie one last time. The woman he had loved for so long, the woman who had shared his life, was now just a stranger. He didn't know what came next, but he knew this was the only way for him to heal. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him, leaving the home he had once known. The days following Nate's decision to file for divorce felt like a blur, each one blending into the next with a heavy, suffocating weight. The house, once full of life and conversation, now felt like a hollow shell. Every room echoed with the silence of a family torn apart, each of them navigating the emotional wreckage in their own way. Nate had moved out, staying in a small apartment just a few blocks away, but it didn't feel like home. It felt temporary, a makeshift solution to the chaos he had left behind. The only thing that kept him going was the fact that he was away from Sophie, the woman who had betrayed him, the woman he had loved. But the anger that had fueled his decision began to fade, replaced by a deep, gnawing emptiness. Lily, on the other hand, was a different story. She had been angry with Sophie from the moment Nate had made his decision. At first she had refused to speak to her mother altogether, retreating into her room, closing herself off from the world. The divide between them had only grown, and now Nate couldn't help but wonder how this would affect her in the long term. He sat in his small apartment, staring out the window at the city below, trying to find some sense of clarity. His thoughts kept drifting back to Lily. How lost she looked, how fragile she had become. He wanted to help her, to fix things, but how could he? He had no answers. He didn't know how to navigate this new reality, this new version of their family. The phone buzzed on the table beside him, snapping him out of his thoughts. He looked at the screen and saw Sophie's name. He hesitated, unsure if he wanted to speak to her, but after a long moment he picked it up. "Nate," Sophie's voice came through the phone, softer than he remembered. "Can we talk?" He closed his eyes, rubbing a hand over his face. "What is there to talk about, Sophie? I've made my decision." I know, she said quickly. "But I need to explain. I need you to understand. You've been so angry, and I get it, I do, but please, just listen to me." Nate didn't know what to say. He didn't want to hear more apologies, more excuses, but there was something in her voice that made him pause, something that made him feel as though maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story than he had heard. "All right," he said, his voice guarded. "I'm listening." Sophie took a shaky breath. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About how much I've messed up, about how I hurt you, about how much I hurt Lily, too. But I want you to know, I never meant for it to go this far. The affair, the lies, it was all so stupid. But I was so lost, Nate. I was so desperate for something real, something that made me feel seen. And Alex, he was there, and he made me feel like I mattered." Nate felt his stomach twist at the mention of Alex's name. He wanted to scream, to tell her that he didn't care about her excuses, but he kept quiet, letting her continue. "But none of that matters now," Sophie continued. "What matters is that I love you, Nate, and I love Lily. I'm not asking for forgiveness, not yet, but I need you to know that I will do anything to make things right. I'll do whatever it takes to show you that I am sorry, that I'm sorry for everything." Nate's hands trembled slightly as he held the phone, but he said nothing for a long moment. The hurt, the betrayal, it was still raw, still fresh in his mind. But there was a part of him, a small part, that wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that things could be fixed, that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to the way things had been before everything fell apart. "I don't know if that's possible, Sophie," he said. his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Sophie's silence on the other end of the line stretched on for a few moments, and Nate could feel the weight of her pain. "I know," she finally said. "I understand, but I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove it. I know it's not going to be easy. It's going to take time, but I'm here. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Nate closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. He had no idea what the future held, no idea if he could ever truly forgive Sophie for what she had done. But the thought of letting go, of moving on completely, felt like a weight too heavy to carry. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you," Sophie whispered. "That's all I'm asking for." As he hung up the phone, Nate stared at the empty room around him. Everything felt uncertain now. The future was a blur, and he didn't know what to expect. Sophie's words lingered in his mind, but they didn't give him the comfort he needed. Instead, they only added to the confusion. He thought about Lily, about the rift that had formed between them and Sophie. He thought about the love he had once felt for his wife, and how it had been shattered by a moment of weakness. But he also thought about the possibility of healing, of moving forward. But one thing was clear. No matter what happened, their family would never be the same again. And neither would he. The morning air was cold as Nate stood at the front door, staring at the moving boxes stacked neatly beside the driveway. He hadn't realized how much space Sophie's absence would leave behind, how empty everything would feel once she was gone. She had packed her things in silence, the sounds of drawers closing, of clothes being folded, a stark contrast to the tension that had built up in the house for weeks. Sophie stood behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her gaze fixed on the ground. The soft sound of her breathing was the only noise in the otherwise still morning. Nate could feel her presence without having to turn around. But he didn't need to look at her to know what this moment was, the end. The finality of it had settled deep in his bones. "I guess this is it," Sophie said, her voice a whisper, barely audible over the beating of Nate's heart. Nate didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure he had the strength to say anything meaningful, anything that would bring closure to the years they had spent together. There was nothing left to say. The hurt was too deep. The trust had been shattered beyond repair. He glanced at her for the first time in days, seeing her so broken, her eyes filled with guilt, regret, and sorrow. She looked so different now, this woman who had once been his partner, his confidant, now just a stranger. "I didn't want this, Sophie," Nate said quietly, his voice raw. The words felt heavy as they left his lips. "I didn't want to lose you, but I can't keep pretending everything's fine, not after everything you've done." Sophie nodded, her face crumpling with the weight of his words. She didn't argue. She couldn't. She knew it was too late for apologies, too late for explanations. The damage had been done, and the person she was now didn't deserve Nate's forgiveness. "I know," Sophie whispered. "I know I ruined everything, and I'm sorry. I'll always be sorry, but I understand if you can't forgive me." Her words were laced with a sorrow that Nate couldn't escape, a sorrow that only made him feel more distant. There was nothing left between them now but the painful truth, a truth that had broken them both. "I don't think I can forgive you," Nate said, his voice firm but tinged with sadness. "Not right now. Not with everything that's happened. Maybe one day, but not today. I can't keep living in the past, Sophie. I need to move forward." Sophie's lips trembled, but she didn't say anything more. She knew he was right. She had betrayed him in a way that couldn't be undone, and no amount of regret would change that. She had lost him, lost everything. Sophie took a step forward, her hand trembling as she reached for him, but she stopped herself. There was no point in holding on anymore. She had to let go. "Goodbye, Nate," she said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. Nate turned away, not able to face her any longer. The sight of her standing there, so vulnerable, so full of pain, was too much to bear. He had to walk away, for his own sake, for his future. As he got into his car and started the engine, Sophie stood there watching him go. She didn't chase after him. She didn't scream. She just watched as the car disappeared down the road, the space between them widening with every mile he drove away. Nate didn't look back. The weight in his chest was still there, but with each passing moment it felt a little easier to breathe. He was leaving behind the life he had once known, the life he had tried so hard to hold together. But it was over now. There was no turning back. He thought about Lily, about how she was taking all of this in. The anger and confusion she must have felt, the way she had closed herself off from Sophie. He had to be there for her now. She needed him. They both needed time to heal, but it would come. He hoped it would. Nate's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled away, his heart heavy, but resolute. There was no more room for Sophie in his life, not after everything. And though he couldn't see what the future held, one thing was clear. He was moving forward, alone.